Welcome to the Law Council of Australia's online event, Frontline Legal Services in Times of Crisis. My name is Dr. Jacoba Brasch QC, and I'm very honoured to be the President of the Law Council of Australia. And I've just seen that the sun is coming through blinds at an exact time, and I look like that I've been beamed up from a spaceship, but I'll fix that in a minute. We'll press on. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Law Council Secretariat is situated, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend this respect to the traditional custodians of all the lands from which attendees are dialing in with us this afternoon, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders who may be present. I'm absolutely delighted to have the marvellous guest panellists with me this afternoon, Rowan McRae, Nassim Arrage, and David Woodroffe. Rowan, Nassim and David each bring a unique perspective on the opportunities and challenges facing various legal assistance services as they help Australians navigate times of crisis and natural disaster, often on the front lines. Let me tell you about the three of them in case you're not aware of each or all. Rowan is Executive Director of Civil Justice Access and Equity at Victorian Legal Aid. She has, of course, this morning just had her lockdown extended. Rowan joined the Equality Law Program at Victorian Legal Aid in 2016. Prior to Victorian Legal Aid, Rowan worked at the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, the Victorian Commission, in the offices of International Law and Constitutional Law at the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department. She was absolutely jealous associate to Justice Hayne of the High Court. He frightened the living daylights out of me, Rowan. On a few occasions I've appeared before him. It was the real, sweat on the brow kind of question. His ability to sum up the failings of your case in one question was really, really quite outstanding. Rowan has also practiced in the private profession and on legal development projects in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. She holds the Masters of Law. Nassim, I'm sure, would be known to many of you, particularly in the community legal sector, of course. Passionate advocate for the community legal sector. Since becoming CEO of CLCs Australia, Nassim engaged in the national voice, as the national voice of the sector, to amplify awareness of the effective and unique approach of community legal centres in addressing systemic inequality. Wherever I can, I absolutely trumpet the work of CLCs. The idea that lawyers are all rich up in their ivory towers, there are so many of us that give, so many who could have lucrative professions in the private practice, but choose to address social justice issues and for remuneration, which is so less than what they could get in private practice. Absolute unsung heroes. Under Nassim's leadership, a key sector priority is addressing the climate crisis, other human-induced disasters such as bushfires, ensuring communities have access to justice in COVID-19, as well as communicating to key stakeholders the critical role that community legal centres play in ensuring communities can safely emerge from these crises. David is descended from the Jingili Modbra clan group, principal legal officer for the Northern Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, the NAAJA, and you had a big day on Monday with the AGA being presented again. NAAJA is the largest legal service in the Northern Territory, delivering culturally appropriate services in the legal and justice sector. David's responsible, listen to this, 160 staff, of which 80 are lawyers and 50% of the employees are Aboriginal. He's also amongst the first cohort of Indigenous law graduates in the Northern Territory, and currently one of the most senior Indigenous lawyers in the nation. So we have three panellists who I'll be asking questions of, but I will here and there, I'm the only private practitioner on the panel at least, and so I might here and there put in my 10 cents about the pro bono work that we do in times of crisis, that we generally do, and let's not forget that we contribute a little bit as well too. So this afternoon, we're going to explore the context, the roles and needs of legal assistance services during times of emergency, pandemic, as we have now, natural disaster, or other. There are three areas I'd particularly like to explore. First, as has become all too apparent on a global scale in the past 18 months or thereabouts, disaster triggers an avalanche of personal, family, institutional, and economic problems. Can I say, as a family lawyer, the rates of family violence in times of crisis, particularly the last 18 months when people have been locked under the one roof, has been absolutely phenomenal, and I do not use that adverb in a good way. That, of course, presents challenges for the legal services industry. But in our challenging circumstances, practitioners at Frontline Legal Services may need to assume roles as counsellors and advocates for their clients. They may need to work with or make referrals to other service providers, medical practitioners, social workers, housing support groups, social supports. One of the things I'm keen to explore today is the perspective of the lawyers before us on the front line and the views on what is required to be responsive and effective in times of crisis. Now, that segues nicely, I think, into our second topic of discussion, being the key areas of legal need that arise in times of emergency and the resourcing requirements for the legal assistance sector to meet these needs. The bushfires of 1920, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic will be topical case studies for this discussion, where we've seen a patchwork of funding announcements for legal services. And I'll be asking our panellists their views on whether this goes far enough or if there's more sustainable long-term solutions. And finally, I want to talk about how legal assistance services can be better coordinated in times of emergency, noting, of course, the 2020 Bushfire Royal Commission remarks that legal assistance services would benefit from greater planning when responding to emergencies. Emergencies, by their nature, strike when we least expect, but it's incumbent upon us to be prepared. It was interesting that when we had our floods, a lot of law firms, this is a decade ago now, a lot of law firms are absolutely swamped. Servers didn't work, couldn't get in. They all had to create disaster recovery plans then, which held them in good stead for when almost a decade later, they couldn't go into the office, but still needed to deliver services. So the legal service assistance sector has a very proud history of coordination and collaboration, and I'm interested to see and understand how this can be applied in an emergency setting. So I'm going to pose some questions to each of our panellists, and I'll throw to them, and I'll try and keep you all on time so we can finish at 6 o'clock so people can go and cook dinner, eat dinner, or do whatever it is they need to do. I'm hoping we finish with enough time that there can be some questions from the floor. Each of us will put ourselves on mute when we're not speaking to try and help with the audio acuity of it all. But for all of the people listening, if you have any questions, please tick the Q&A bubble that's on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those as we can. And I see I've got a question already, so we'll get back to that in due course. So you're welcome to send your questions through, and we'll get to them where we can. My first question, and I'll start with you, Rowan, simply because you're the next to me on the screen, at least as I'm looking at it. I'm interested in all of your views on the role of the legal assistance sector in times of crisis, and whether there are any particular challenges or opportunities you have encountered in your respective sectors, the three of your sectors, when supporting clients in times of emergency. So, Rowan, please.
Thanks very much for the question and for the lovely introduction. And I should just start by acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri land and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. The role of the legal assistance sector in times of crisis. Well, the starting point is that crises are by their nature things that create great stress and trauma and disruption to communities and to individuals. And so we see the impact of crises on small businesses, on farmers, on sole traders, on individuals within those communities. And we might in fact see that the disasters have an impact on legal service providers. As you were mentioning earlier, in the context of the floods, often disasters will mean that there isn't access to courts, there isn't access to legal assistance in the local area. So what we want the role of the legal assistance sector to be is basically to assist people to navigate their way through the disaster, to help them with the legal effects of disaster that are direct, and that might be something like accessing government support, or it might be dealing with an insurance claim, or it might be indirect, the sorts of things you were mentioning earlier, like the family violence impact of disasters. It might be custody arrangements that have been disrupted because people have had to move out of their homes. So what we want lawyers to be doing is to be helping people to navigate their way through this system with legal information, with legal advice, and making sure that people's rights are respected. The other role for the legal assistance sector is to help prepare for these disasters, to make sure that we've given some thought in advance to what the impact might be. That might be community legal education on insurance, for example. We saw with the recent fires in Victoria that some sessions that VLA lawyers had run in Malakuta on insurance actually had an impact on how people then were able to recover after the fires came through. So a practical example of how work in advance of a disaster can actually assist people to minimise the impact on them. What we have here in Victoria is a partnership called Disaster Legal Help Victoria. It's a partnership that involves Victoria Legal Aid, it involves the Law Institute of Victoria, the Vic Bar, it involves the Federation of Community Legal Centres, and it involves Justice Connect. So we are equal partners in this organisation that responds to disasters, and we use it to harness our skills collectively and harness our infrastructure and share that so that we can respond to disasters and provide communities with the legal assistance they need. It's a really effective partnership. We met weekly during the bushfires in 2019-20 and more recently in the floods. And we have been successful in securing some funding for the legal assistance sector doing this kind of work. In terms of challenges and opportunities, I'll mention a couple of challenges that are probably also opportunities. I think one big challenge for the legal assistance sector is that people with legal needs in the context of disasters don't often recognise that these are legal issues they're dealing with. It's the classic civil law problem. It's not limited to disasters, but it's that situation where people might not recognise that the problem they're dealing with has legal aspects and would benefit from legal advice. So that is one of the challenges. How do we build capacity in first responders and in the emergency sector to be able to identify legal issues as they come up, and within communities as well, so that individuals can see that they've got a legal problem. The second challenge I'll mention is that we don't invest enough in preparation for disasters. It goes back to those comments I was making earlier. There really is scope to kind of prevent legal issues from arising and to minimise the impact if we invest in between disasters to build those relationships between emergency response and the legal assistance sector. So for example, our Disaster Legal Help Victoria partnership has been working with Bushfires Victoria and the CFA to build those relationships in advance of the fire season. And we need to be engaging with communities, with community legal education about issues like insurance, making sure they've got the coverage that will assist them if a flood or a fire comes through. It's also about building skills in regional areas that are prone to disaster. Do we have people in local community legal centres who have consumer law experience, who can assist with insurance law, and amongst private practitioners too? Are there ways we can build that capacity to be able to respond?
Thank you very much, Rowan. David.
Thank you, Jacoba, and thanks, Rowan. That was fantastic.
Oh, David, it's gone. David, it's gone wonky again.
Better?
No, why don't we do the trick we did before? I'll throw to Nassim now. If you want to log out and log back in, fingers crossed, we'll be good as gold. So, Nassim, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Bundjalung country and pay respects to the elders past, present and present. Look, I think I want to be a bit cheeky in the first instance and unpack the question a little bit because we're using, like, it's interesting the language that we're using. We're using times of emergency, times of crisis, natural disasters, and like we're on day 3 of having the the international panel on climate change report that's saying that none of this is natural. Actually, it's human-driven climate crisis that is having the impacts that we're experiencing. And so I think we need to rethink about how we are viewing the current situation. So obviously there's bushfires, there's floods, there's COVID-19, but increasingly there will be events like this that will be coming up, and we're going to be lurching from one crisis to the next. So this webinar is really timely in having to reflect on what we need to be ready. In terms of, like, if we talk specifically about COVID-19, what we've found in community legal centres across Australia is that it's like the existing systemic issues have been like exposed and intensified. So it's already people who are experiencing discrimination and disadvantage that really feel the effects of the pandemic. Like most recently, if we look at Western Sydney and the situation there, it's already people on lower incomes or rely on cash in hand jobs or having to go to a workplace, not being able to work from home, that are experiencing a lockdown and as a result are losing income, and are losing income at a time where the government isn't coming forward with an economic stimulus package, which it did at the very beginning of the pandemic. So this is having cascading effects that are rippling through. I think it's also interesting that we're at a time in the pandemic that we are still working out what's going on. The way that the pandemic is impacting is changing all the time. Like, if we were having this webinar in May, we might have said, oh, there's light at the end of the tunnel, it looks like it's coming to an end. But then in a month, it's like lockdowns across like almost the whole country, but a really significant part of the population is now affected. So what does all of that mean for legal assistance? Well, there's a lot of opportunities and challenges. In terms of opportunities, it is finding new ways and more effective ways to deliver services to the people that need them, staying connected with the communities and the people that most need help and being able to reach and support them. In terms of like challenges, again, it kind of cuts 2 ways. First of all, our organisations are made up of people who are also impacted by the pandemic. People are homeschooling at the moment, particularly in Sydney, people are homeschooling. So they're somehow having to be at work and look after children at the same time. It's a massive, it's a massive undertaking. It's not something that we should expect people to be able to do, but we seem to. So there's all of that, those factors of having to support staff as they are experiencing a crisis or a trauma, and then being able to support them as they are helping people who are also experiencing the crisis and the trauma, and often in more intensified ways. So there's a real challenge around, how you keep the wheels turning while you're amping up service delivery to meet the new and changing needs. I think the role of the legal assistance sector is also to give as much advice to government as we can early on, and that any system change will result in legal need. So like what we saw at the very beginning of the pandemic was when JobSeeker and JobKeeper were introduced, there was a big spike, you know, in inquiries about social security payments. And similarly, when that came to an, like when those payments came to an end, there was similarly a spike. So there's ways we can minimise. Also, like there's ways to put downward pressure on legal need by having good government policy that like supports transition and reduces the amount of change in systems.
Thank you. Nassim, David.
Thank you, Jacoba. I would also like to acknowledge all Aboriginal peoples and traditional countries that we're meeting on today. I'm very fortunate to be on Arrage country in Alice Springs. Many of the barriers that the First Nations people face, and particularly around access to justice and health and education and the like, are very much sort of compounded in times of natural disaster, but also in pandemics. When we look to issues particularly around chronic disease, poverty, homelessness, overcrowding, particularly what's already been raised around finding not just culturally safe, but also safe places for victims of family and domestic and sexual violence, but also finding emergency accommodation during those periods of time. We've also got to reflect upon the decades-long lack of investments that's happened in our remote and regional communities, particularly around infrastructure, technology, employment, and these are all really compounding factors. You know, an obvious and very simple example is the digital divide between Aboriginal people living in remote communities, and with as small as 10% of people have access to internet, and also the flow-on issues around secure connectivity and also to power. But we've also have to think about the compounding issues as well of our justice system that hasn't invested in our regions, and particularly remote regions, around in locally based programs and services, employments and probation and supervision in those programs. Those are some of the very important sort of challenges, and following on what Nassim spoke about there's a critical need to look after the well-being of our staff, and particularly around Aboriginal staff as well, when we think reflecting on those health issues amongst the Aboriginal population is also among your workforce, but also their families, their loved ones and extended families. So there are a lot of not only pressures, but there's also a lot of immediate pressures in how do we look after, support our staff, but also how do we support our community. I think one of the great sort of opportunities that's come out of these situations of crisis is really about developing more holistic, comprehensive and multidisciplinary approaches to people's needs, and not just their legal needs, but how do we ensure things such as people's around food security, questions around gouging and price gouging and overcrowding, education, and particularly around the need to have education around health and in times of health crisis, but also in other crises. Not just in communities, but also in relation to places of detention, of children in custody and adults in detention, and also children in residential care. I think really some of the great opportunities, and I'm very happy to expand on, is how do we get to have justice in our communities and empowering local communities to have community-based organisations and people who are involved in justice, who are able to, and we've been very privileged to partner with many Aboriginal communities in remote regions in developing community-based people who are able to work and contact people so that you're maintaining that direct connection with the community as to people's legal needs. Because most importantly, legal needs don't disappear during periods of lockdown. They are ongoing, and sometimes they can be ongoing for many, many months. So it's an important, I think, a two-way process. We need to sort of be helping communities, but we also need to be hearing what's happening and going on in the communities. So I think empowering local communities, empowering local people, that's the way forward, not just reforming our justice system, but to meet these challenges, and whether that's regional challenges, but individual community challenge from now and onwards.
Thank you, David. Seeing I very much in my own law practice, and I, acknowledge I'm in private practice, I always want to look at the whole of the person. Now, I do family law, so I'm dealing with people in crisis. And I suppose if you've got a commercial contract biff, then that's what it is. But I look at my client, not just what's the family law problem, but the whole of the person. What do they need? And I certainly encourage those who I mentor, my colleagues, the whole of the person, because there's something Rowan said before is absolutely right. A lot of people don't realise they've got a legal problem until it's a bit too late to preemptively fix the problem. But the holistic approach. And the other thing you touch on, David, which is very dear to my heart too, and something I've tried to talk about this year, is the vicarious trauma that can be caused to lawyers themselves. We all see and hear some awfully distressing things, and we have to be a bit better, I think, at looking after ourselves. And I also think we have to be a bit better at saying to our colleagues, are you okay? And for it being okay to say, no, I'm not, I'm struggling. So I absolutely, David, echo the whole of the person. And we've got to get rid of the idea that, lawyering is like the Wolf of Wall Street and aggressive and etc. We are people too, and we all need to look out for each other. Next question, thank you. I enjoyed that very much. My next question to each of you, what do you perceive as the key areas of legal need that arise in times of emergency? And I really take your point, Nassim, about I think the adjective of natural as in disaster is one that really we need to rethink. I had the absolute privilege of, I was invited to attend the American Bar Association's opening of their AGM, and Senator, but he's now Commissioner John Kerry, spoke at that about global warming, and it was frightening what he had to say, and he would not use the word natural. It was man-made disaster. But anyway, back to my question, I digress. Well, I want to know what each of you perceive to be the key areas of legal need that arise in times of emergency. We can take COVID as an example. What resourcing does the legal assistance sector require to meet the needs of clients in these challenging times? So I might go reverse this time. David, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jacoba. Well, I think the critical needs is really maintaining access to communities, but also ensuring that communities can have access to their legal services and support services. And also really that does mean either ensuring that we have the ways of travelling out to communities in times of hotspots and remote lockdowns, but also particularly around how do we maintain that same quality of access and of service to people who are isolated or through technology, and with the difficulties that I've spoken about, but also addressing critically, I think, maintaining the ability to look at people's complex needs, but also the whole range of sort of variety of needs people will have, and particularly around, I'm thinking around disability support, and how do we ensure that we provide that same level of support for people with disabilities, and not just in accessing to our services, but in means and modes of communication where it may not be possible, or find alternatives. I think one other critical thing is directing funding and learnings, not just in relation to addressing issues around demand needs, but also looking at funding for research and data, but how we can actually learn from this, how we can actually find the gaps during these times of disaster, and such as COVID-19, but actually how we can improve working with community about in creating local community legal empowerment, through organisations. But I think most importantly, we've all got to learn and hear from the voices of people who've been impacted by this. People because of their age, their gender, sexual and domestic violence. But actually how we can learn to improve those services, collaborate in our services, but actually provide funding that meets the gaps that are happening right now. So I think they're the real critical two things that we need to do, but also in how we can, I think, is funding that way we can collaborate together and share best practice and share common knowledge to improve the whole sector, because this is a community approach, and legal services and the private sector, everyone must come towards as a community to support one another.
Thank you very much, David. Nassim.
Thank you. So I guess, firstly, we know with disasters generally, and I think COVID is the same, we don't really see the legal need usually till about 3 to 6 months after the event. And the interesting thing about, let's say, COVID in particular is it's like an ongoing event. So like the clock is starting like every day, it's kind of resetting. And what was interesting, I think, about COVID was the government, the economic stimulus package that the government brought to the table, that really in a way fully ended in March, in terms of the way that I'm talking about people and communities. It's so when JobSeeker and JobKeeper both like fully came to an end, that's when I mentally, you know, started the clock. And I in my mind, it was going to be July, August that we saw the real need. But I say but at the same time, the nature of the emergency is changing, right? With now, with the different lockdowns and the high infection rates in Sydney. So we got to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. But generally, what we see is a bunch of legal need around family violence. So in a crisis, people are often stuck with their the perpetrator of violence in a more stressful situation. Where everybody is under pressure. So there's a collection of legal issues usually around that. And then usually things around money. So it might be accessing Centrelink, it might be debts, different types of debts, whether it's paying rent, paying back a mortgage, other kinds of loans, other bills. We tend to see those kinds of legal issues. As I said, with COVID, what we saw was an immediate, like with the announcement of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and also people losing their jobs, there was an immediate need for social security and employment related advice. And then as the pandemic kind of continued around June again and end of financial year, there was like another spike in terms of employment related advice. And I think because businesses were reviewing like their end of year finances and making decisions going forward. So that's, I think, like that's it in a nutshell, like the legal need. But I do want to support what both Rowan and David have said around there is really a need to take the multidisciplinary approach to see the whole of the person, not just look at the legal problem in isolation, because often the legal problem is driven by social factors. You know, it is the family violence, it's the loss of a job, it is losing your house being burnt down. This is what are the drivers of the legal need. It's like the legal problems in a way come after. But also noting that unresolved legal problems have a massive impact on people's mental health and their health ongoing, so that we should see the legal services as essential and part of a healthy community. If I talk about resourcing then for a moment, it's, I think what's been heartening in terms of this year's budget was the association between legal assistance and health broadly. You know, so we saw new funds come through for mental health. We saw new funds come through for family violence. We saw new funds come through for child sexual assault. So all of these kinds of things that affect, you know, like there's a mental health aspect, but there is a well-being aspect to all of these things. But I think, and I know it's not sexy for government, and this is the challenge for us to do. But what we don't need is these special buckets of money. We just need a certain level of sustained funding that give us the resilience to be able to flex and pivot to the most pressing issue. I think the biggest issue that the legal assistance sector faces, and this is all legal service providers in the sector, is the massive amount of under-resourcing that is now been going on for at least a couple of decades. And the government has been on notice at least since the 2014 Productivity Commission report. There were recommendations there. The Law Council has done its own project soon after. So we can look at what the level of resourcing required is. Like, it's getting bigger every day, but we know that that resourcing also saves money down the track. Like, if we can, the early intervention work, the resolving the problems sooner, actually saves us all money. So it's that being able to get the investment up front that's really important.
Couldn't agree more, thank you, because the initial problem then becomes another problem, which becomes another problem, which becomes another, and the horrible snowballing effect. And that's sort of what I was talking about before. If we can get in early, the funding that is needed, and it's all governments, you know, it's been a succession of governments that have not adequately understood that you put money in at the beginning, you front load the assistance, the packages. Stitch in time saves nine, you know, that old adage. And so I often see what started off as a housing crisis or an inability to get children to school, which means child safety comes in, or there's a social problem that starts that then leads to a whole range of other things. And if we could get in early, get in aggressively at the beginning with what is needed for that person. And one of the questions that came up a little while earlier was exactly about that. Panellist perspective on the opportunity of crisis to connect legal help with other human and health and human services. We've been talking about that, the whole of the person. Rowan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, I think those issues around escalation of legal problems really need to be taken into consideration here, and the fact that if you can engage early or even at a preventative stage, that's really much, should be the preferred option, as opposed to the kind of tertiary end where things are really complex and difficult to resolve. I think to start with this question around what is legal need in the context of disasters, COVID is a tricky example here because disasters are by their nature supposed to be exceptional, and COVID is no longer kind of exceptional in that way. It has had an impact right across the justice sector. And so I feel like it's quite difficult to use that as an example. Our disaster legal help service did activate in relation to the hard lockdown of some public housing in Victoria last year, and that was really to support communities in that public housing to get access to legal information about support and services that could assist them. It was a very culturally diverse community, and there were lots of issues around how the government engaged with those communities. So we did activate in relation to that, but we haven't activated in relation to COVID as a whole because it's just so enormous. And if you think about a lawyer who is on the front line in some kind of recovery centre or hub, the breadth of issues they have to deal with is enormous. So, when we send people down to bushfire recovery hubs, they're dealing with insurance issues, lost identity documents, family law, family violence, fencing is a really big one, planning law, tenancy, help with government assistance, small business and farm related issues. And a lot of these are not traditionally the areas where, say, Victoria Legal Aid would have practice experience. We don't have a lot of fencing or planning law practice experience. So this is one area where the private profession really comes to the fore. But what it means for the lawyer on the front line is that their skills can't be across all of those issues. They have to be experts in triage and referral, and to understand those holistic needs and who they can refer people onto to get assistance, not only with their legal issues, but related issues like housing, for example. So the key challenge for the lawyer is linking people to the assistance they need in a really effective way. But one point I wanted to make about legal need is that one of the voices that's missing from the conversation often is that of the community, going back to some of the things David was saying earlier. Because disasters come in and have such a huge effect on people, by the time they're over, we've moved on. And we don't go back to those communities and say, did you get the assistance you needed? What were your legal issues? Were they resolved with the help that you received? We need to make sure that we're engaging with the people who are affected by disasters to understand what's important to them. What are the legal issues that are keeping them up at night, and are they being addressed? And the importance in that context of culturally safe legal assistance services too, for First Nations communities, and that means the involvement of Aboriginal community controlled organisations like Victoria, the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service here in Victoria. They need to be at the table and involved in disaster response. In terms of resourcing for disaster legal assistance tends to be really ad hoc, it tends to be retrospective, it tends to be responsive. It all happens after the fact and down the track. And it does usually happen, but it's complicated to have to put up the services in advance and then receive the funding later, especially for smaller community organisations like CLCs. So it's not ideal. What you really want is some sort of contingency funding for disasters. So there is an existing pool of money that can be drawn upon in the case of emergency to ensure that people get the service delivery they need. And that needs to last, I think Nassim mentioned earlier, it needs to last until the disaster ends, which can be quite far down the track with legal issues. So we were still getting calls about the 2009 bushfires to our disaster legal help number several years afterwards as people start to resolve their insurance issues. But just to go back to this point I've made previously, the resourcing for preparation is equally important. We've got to be bringing the legal assistance sector together to do the mapping of where our services are and where the gaps are, so that we can start to fill those gaps before the disaster. So I think the resourcing needs to be have some mind both to how we provide services in the context of disaster, but also how we do that preventative work.
Thank you, Rowan. I'll make a couple of observations before I ask one question of each of you to conclude our afternoon. The idea of the spike that Nassim talked about is just so right. My own first experience was frontline lawyering in crisis was the floods we had a decade ago in Brisbane, southeast and other parts of southeast Queensland. The courts were flooded, we couldn't go to work anyway, but the first assistance we were giving, of course, was helping our mates get the mud, the water out of their houses, bringing them. But then after the waters subsided, a little bit after that, people are looking at their insurance. And it was, so the waters had gone, the problem itself had gone, but that's when our legal aid put a call out, please come along. Now, Rowan's absolutely right. I know nothing about insurance law, but there were certainly plenty of family law issues that were arising out of that. And so the triaging that went on was matching the need of the person with a lawyer that could help. One of the interesting on this question of what's come out of the, what's needed, give you an example of what happened in the family court in March last year. Angela Lynch, who would be known to many of you, and particularly you, Nassim, at the start of our lockdown, she phoned me and said, look, there are lots of people using COVID as an excuse not to hand the children over, being opportunistic about it. What can you do? I said, write me a letter and I'll make sure it gets to the Chief Justice. And her letter resulted within a week. That was a Sunday we talked. The Monday she sent me the letter. By the Friday, the Chief Justice of the Family Court of Australia announced the COVID-19 list. It was a list, it was online, It was done very quickly, and if COVID was being used as an excuse, either legitimately or opportunistically, those matters were fast-tracked to the court. Didn't matter where the judge was because we were all online. Now, if you'd asked me this time 2 years ago, would we have ever had a list like that, I would have gone, whatever. That list still exists because the needs existed. So I have to acknowledge and very proudly acknowledge, first of all, Angela Lynch's role in that, her spotting there was a problem, but also the court's reaction to creating something new and very quickly. You make an interesting point, Rowan, about money. You know, it's almost like there should be a pot of money that sits there. And you know, when a national emergency is declared, or there's a state emergency declared, that activates access to the pot of money that sits there. It's something interesting we can think about. Question for each of you. Ended with you then, Rowan. I'm going to start with you now. From your perspective, reflecting on the response to the bushfires, the 1920 bushfires, are there any clear areas for improvement in the coordination of legal assistance services? And if so, what are they?
Yes, we learned a lot through our engagement with communities in the 2019-20 bushfire season, and we spent a bit of time across our partnership reflecting on that engagement and what we've learned from it. And we've come up with 5 principles that we want to take forward, and I think they really reflect our learnings from the bushfires. And the first, it does go back to some of the things David was saying too earlier. The first principle we have is that it needs to be local first. We need to focus on building local capacity to respond to disasters, because what we heard from local community legal centres and local private practitioners was that they know their communities, they want to be able to assist. They don't want loads of Melbourne lawyers trooping out to save their communities. They want to be the ones engaging and helping those communities. So we need to look at how we can support local CLCs, local private practitioners and local legal aid lawyers to do that work with their communities. And that might mean something like, if they are usually running a duty lawyer list at court, can we backfill them so that they can go up to the recovery hub and do the work with their communities? What kind of support can we put in place? What training can we put in place? Can we give them the psych support and trauma counselling they might need to do this work? So that's the first thing, local first. The second thing is building on deep preparation. And I've mentioned that several times tonight, but I think we need to think about the referral networks that are in place within local and state frameworks. And we need to make sure they're there before the disaster happens. The third principle we have is disaster response needs to be client-centred, and it goes back to my points about listening to the client voice, having clients involved in the process and understanding from them what their needs are. So we need to make sure our legal assistance is culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive. And that means engaging with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to do this work. The fourth principle we have is around leveraging volunteer support. And going back to your examples, Jacoba, of working in the flood context, there will be times when we need to leverage significant centralised support, where we need to call on the Law Institute or the Vic Bar to assist us with going along to recovery centres, providing information where the local profession aren't able to do that because they're affected by disaster. And so we need to build that capacity too, and to figure out clever ways of connecting up skills with legal need. So things like Justice Connect's pro bono portal that links up barristers with people who have legal problems. Last principle is it's got to be integrated with other services. This holistic point is not just about law in isolation. It's got to be connected in with a holistic approach to need that goes beyond legal issues. So thinking about housing, thinking about mental health, thinking about what it is that client needs to be supported through disaster.
Terrific, thank you. In Queensland have Law Right. used to be QPILCH, now Law Right, and I think most states and territories have fabulous. I really love getting the beat. Well, I don't love, that's probably the wrong way to say it, but I look forward to seeing what's coming through from our Law Right. Can I assist? Who's going to assist? And when I say look forward to getting it, because it gives me a very good view of what are the problems, that I might necessarily see. What are the needs? What are the issues? Where do they come from, in the sense of what actually is the fundamental problem that we need to approach holistically? Nassim, CLCs Australia, your emergence program, as CLC Australia, the emergence program is looking at the challenges for CLCs over the next decade, which will no doubt acknowledge that natural disasters are likely to become more prominent. I won't use that word, natural disasters. I'll use the word man-made, person-made disasters are likely to become more prominent. How's the CLC sector best going to prepare for the future and be in a position to effectively respond to whatever the next crisis is?
So look, my modus operandi is to be cheeky and look, the sector is prepared. It's as prepared as it can be. And that's not to say that we can't learn from each event, each crisis, and, you know, tweak the way that we do things, learn new things. But the sector, the community legal centres across Australia have been working really, really hard to meet the needs of people and communities across Australia, from the 2019-20 bushfires and in response to COVID-19. And, you know, and there was almost no break between, like, let's not forget that period of waking up every day with the smoke in the back of your throat, as like huge thousands of kilometres were on fire. But there was almost no break between that and then the impact of COVID-19. And so centres and their staff have been working really hard. I think what we need to be able to do is, and it's almost boring to say it, but we need to convince government to step up to the table in terms of the resourcing, also to go that this is now all predictable. This is not, they're not random events. We can probably predict where fires are going to happen. We can probably predict where floods are going to happen with a reasonable level of accuracy. So let's start planning for those now. So we might not be able to say exactly what month and exactly where, but we've probably got a really good idea of where all of that's going to happen. And so with additional resourcing, you know, centres can be ready or more resourced to be more effective in those situations. We need to, I guess, one thing that we need to do in acknowledgement of all that kind of trauma-informed approach is community legal centres have had multidisciplinary and trauma-informed approaches for a very long time now. But we need to give them more scale so that when we're in something like COVID-19, when we're separated, physically separated from our staff, we know that we're providing them with the best support that we can so that they can get on with doing the really important work of solving the legal problems coming out of crisis.
Thank you. I've actually been wondering over the last few years whether there should actually be a subject at law school that's compulsory, that is, you know, I call it law in times of disaster and crisis. Because when you finish your 4 years of a law degree, you have no idea what in fact lawyering can involve. And it's something that's been roaming around in my head, particularly over this year, over the last 2 years, and then previously with the floods that we experienced here. David, the final question is to you, and then we'll wrap up for everybody listening. We might go a couple of minutes over time, but we'll wrap up after that. Are there particular factors that need to be taken into account when legal assessment? Oh, that's Nassim's gone. Sorry, I thought you disappeared on me, David. I was going to say awful. Are there particular factors that need to be taken into account when the legal assistance sector is responding to crises affecting First Nations people?
Thank you, Jacoba. Yes, one of the most sort of critical things that's been touched upon probably repeatedly through the discussion today is about having culturally appropriate services and meeting the needs and the whole range of needs of the individual, and particularly in Indigenous context around language and culture and family and kinship and community needs. I think there's also another critical issue that we all have to focus on is that there's not the widening in the gaps of all marginalised peoples and First Nations peoples, about a widening of the gaps in services and access to services, particularly around justice. So we really do need to take that approach to be thinking and hearing from our communities and from First Nations people of what has been working, where have been the gaps, and what we need to sort of to improve, but most importantly, empowering Indigenous people to have ownership and responsibilities of their justice needs in their community and in their regions. I think equally from a just Indigenous perspective, but in all perspectives, what this is that we are all one people, one community, and we have to not be insular about times of disaster and times of crisis. That we need to be thinking not just for our neighbours, our families, our communities, regionals, but also I think there's a very important process where we have to be thinking internationally as well. We have a very positive, strong partnership with the Solomon Islands Justice Partnership with Indigenous lawyers, and we've got to be thinking equally internationally of in sharing best practice and sharing common experiences and learnings from Australia to internationally to other Indigenous people in other nations, and particularly here in the Pacific and Asia. I think there's also a really critical pace that private legal firms and partnerships can play in this as well, about partnerships with communities, but also to be the innovator in the sphere of technology and to, the commonalities around client engagement court processes, to be the innovator that they've got the time, the research and the money, but also with government, but having partnerships that we can actually transform our justice system. And I do say that the private bar equally has a positive space in that as well. But I think it's the flexibility of legal services and community legal centres who are part of the community, who are centred and are flexible and able to respond to needs, but actually whose focus is the whole of the person and supporting and helping our communities in these critical times. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That brings us, I can't believe that hour has gone so quickly. I think we could have done another hour without any difficulties at all. Rowan, David, Nassim, thank you. Thank you so much for the time that you've given, the thought that you've given. The questions that have been sent through to me, we've covered off in the discussions, which is a terrific sign that you've all anticipated what is concerning or what questions people have out there. I would like to thank the Law Council of Australia's Access to Justice Committee, who drove this online event and maintained their incredible commitment to progress in this important area of law. Thank you to all of you attending. And finally, again, Rowan, David, Nassim, it was fabulous. Good night, everybody. Thank you.